On Truth-Telling. A demonstration of the inseparability of truth from the telling of it. By Michael E. Hunter. 15. Erudition and Earthy experience. Apart from giving myself poor reviews as a playwright and favorable mention as a poet, I should say something about the balancing act I did for so many years between erudition and earthy experience. Having a foot in both camps was never something I simply endured or did unconsciously, but rather cultivated as a sort of long-term experiment. The high in the low and the low in the high was what I tried to sustain or take in or bring out as much as possible as observable phenomena. To be thoroughly grounded in both camps was a way to keep the field open, to keep as far as possible from a thoroughgoing prejudice that, be it of such a nature as to take sides with erudition, in which case I would have felt much more obliged than otherwise to uphold the order principle, or to take sides with earthiness, in which case I would have slandered this principle, would have skewed my findings as one who, though he hardly knew it at the time, had the subject of truth-telling in his sights. When at the age of 25 and freshly back from Europe, I took up residence in a seedy, cockroach-infested apartment, I was not put out by this. For having become more attuned to the errancy in my life as veritable sign or prodigy, I knew I couldn't become overly attached to comfort, security, appearance, and the like. In this respect I was like my father who, although he had grown up in a very respectable home and had been, as I suspect, oriented towards professionalism and material success as well as getting married and raising a family in the suburbs, eventually turned his back on all this as much as he let everything else go. I think this matter of living in substandard conditions provides a touchstone for understanding how I carried on as my father while distinguishing myself from him. From the beginning I chose my living conditions on the basis of economizing and granting to myself the greatest possible freedom. Neither playwriting nor studying at the university brought me an income, and yet there was nothing I wanted to do more than these. Furthermore, they were long-term projects with no guarantee of, in the case of playwriting, leading to success and, in the case of university, for I went about it without a definite plan or goal, leading to professional status and rewards. But apart from studying and playwriting, I was committed to the great project almost unbeknownst to me. The one that was vague and indefinite but somehow took in these activities as well as much else. Deep down I sensed that this great project was something that had to be carried out with highest honor and integrity, with passion, with skill, with endurance and fortitude, with an openness and willingness to experiment beyond the ordinary. Any other future course or career played very dimly in my mind and, if I don't miss my guess, herein lies the difference between what I envisioned for myself and what my sister and father did. For I'm quite sure they were very much like me in having some great project in mind but then fell under the sway of a more common vision. One that had them mixing their highest aims and aspirations with what is generally thought to be most natural, fulfilling, satisfying, and rewarding. That is, one that had them imagining their secret souls as being perfectly compatible with the marital, the domestic, and the professional. But why shouldn't the first be reconcilable with the others? Why should their natural inclination to the hearth, to matters of the heart, to the attendance upon these in good and due form be considered a barrier to some striving for perfection? Isn't it the case that a long list could be drawn up of people who have achieved great things while maintaining a home and family? Or of people who have fulfilled themselves admirably while pursuing a professional career? Time and again I have thought of this and, with respect to my own case but also my sister's and father's, the difference seemed to be that these successful artists, scientists, thinkers, and the like knew very well what road they were on and as jugglers of a sort down this road, what balls they had to keep up in the air and why. It seemed to me then that a great project could be achieved in complicated and even overcomplicated circumstances as long as the project itself was not an overcomplicated affair. A project barely known, a project still on its way to being known would be, in such circumstances, over its head. It was in a miasma of such thoughts, feelings, and memories that I instinctively directed myself towards a sort of material minimalism while maximizing what I took to be my spiritual or mental capabilities. No life pursuit appeared more important to me than this, and no act more shameful or distressing than to give way through weakness and abandon it. While it was grandiose enough to allow me to think of myself as a sort of knight-errant on a noble quest and even a sort of Prometheus having to put up with day-to-day torments, it was also down-to-earth enough to prevent me from being a sort of Don Quixote tilting at windmills. On the other hand, I was conscious of the overwhelming power and enveloping nature of the monster I was contending with as well as its innermost proximity. I don't suppose I can leave out another obsession that had already been with me a long time, namely, maintaining a robust constitution. Years of manual labor as well as activities such as running, cycling, skating, and so on had bequeathed to me a certain strength, confidence, and sense of being able to handle myself in most situations. But to bring this up now is simply to note that, given this preoccupation with physical strength and stamina, I was probably in a better position to rebuff the more materialistic ways of elevating one's status. So it was that, after returning from Europe, I purposely did without a car, a nicely furnished apartment, and other amenities. I also did without a girlfriend, yet this last was far from being a situation sought out and desired. When I look back at it now, I cannot help but think I was somewhat naive, even somewhat stupid in the matter of sexual relations. In other words, it still surprises me I didn't have it in mind more than I did that, by not acquiring the more recognized signs of having good prospects and a hold on the future, I had made it much more difficult for myself. But, then again, what didn't I aspire to in this area that wasn't ridiculously difficult to the point of being utterly vain and unrealistic? Is it possible for me ever to know how much my thoughts, the seemingly non-sexual ones, the seemingly disinterested, objective, and non-egoistic ones, were spurred on by the stick of sexual frustration and lured on by the carrot of sexual fantasy? Or how much this dynamic infiltrated and took possession of the dreams and visions of my earliest childhood? Certainly it is strange to think how this process resembles a lifelong courting ritual, an elaborate flirting around and with a desired object of both earthly and mythical proportions. To say that I hungered for young female flesh is true, but I also had the desire for it only as something forever enduring or replenishing itself, and not as something that would eventually wrinkle, wither, or sag. Secondly, I wanted this flesh only on condition that it wouldn't shake or disturb me too much, or, if it did move me cataclysmically, it would do so only towards a greater understanding of myself. Just as the first then barred me from enthroning in my imagination a sustained coupling, a lifelong union, so did the second. For to bring me closer to myself as a truth-teller was not to play the sentimentalist or deceiver, but rather to confront my animality tout new. The kind of critical remark that's so easy to imagine at this stage, and the kind of retort that, because I never have it on my lips, I hasten to write down. A. Sir, say what you will about confronting your animality, there are many who'll think you're only justifying your immorality. B. True, but the many who'll think that way are precisely those who don't openly confront their animality. A. Tut, sir. That's an ad hominem argument. B. Precisely. Be that I was of less than immaculate bearing, be that I was a sort of moral hybrid, a repressed voluptuary or a restrained sensualist, the upshot of my diverse drives was that, while having a trainer's eye for a good regime, I had a gourmet's or voluptuary's eye for varied experiences. Of course this sort of thing had characterized my earlier years, but, after returning from Europe, it was a much more refined and conscious part of my day-to-day. It spanned both sitting in a classroom and sitting in a theater, as well as much else that could be spanned by these in a figurative sense. Being refined enough to let me know how unrefined I was in this or that circumstance, it was also such as to let me bob up and down in these circumstances without excessive agitation. I was never so chagrined as to lose my essential enthusiasm, nor so cocksure as to close off all internal debate and questioning. Even the sense that I was sailing into an area of personal weakness didn't always make me change course, even if it often made me flinch, and in fact quite often produced the opposite effect. The one of rallying me to do my best even when I knew my best was less than a shining affair. What kind of rapport can there be between erudition and earthiness other than the one between order and errancy? To value the first is to value knowledge of the whole of something, including knowledge of the whole. But by itself, strictly by itself, order or erudition is always mechanical and on the way to becoming moribund. But of course it is never strictly by itself, and so it only has this tendency. This tendency that is nonetheless very old and very tendentious, and, with the long-held faith in God or reason or the two together grounding it and running along its whole base and taking it from broad base to highest peak, a veritable mountain exposing itself to the blasts of the four winds. As such, it gives the appearance of being old and young at the same time, unmovable, unshakable, unchangeable. A thing born anew every day. A towering backdrop casting long shadows over more ephemeral things. Mechanical, mountainous, moribund, tendentious, these are no doubt incongruous elements that mix together magnificence and meanness with a flat efficiency that can run either way. Yet such mental and emotional traffic, such a confused bustling of thoughts and feelings, is what we have from the cradle to the grave, and it would be hard to dignify it were it not for something else that infiltrates it and makes it act like a spur on us. That makes it already the question, the thing to be questioned, the way of demanding something better from and for ourselves as well as from it. Something like the transformation or transfiguration of it, or something like a true sign that the best of all possible worlds has already manifested itself in one way or another, and that its proximity to us is real and perhaps only a few steps away. Well, of course I have in mind here the greatest reach of all things, all human striving, and not simply my own. Not simply my own poor way that may very well be a spoke in the wheel of others. But to confess this is not much more than to note that, given what a great will the world, or, for that matter, an institution is, I tend to be more of an irritating straw, if anything at all, than an obstructing spoke. And so, as a consequence, more protective of my own personal freedom, not to mention survival, than tender in my conscience with respect to any threat I might pose to that greater freedom. More protective then of a paradoxically greater freedom than the greater freedom just mentioned, insofar as the former, qualitatively speaking, outranks the latter. On truth-telling. A demonstration of the inseparability of truth from the telling of it. By Michael E. Hunter. 16. The Scholarly Climb. From the very first I looked upon the university as a kind of mountain to be climbed, and as a kind of spiritual temptation or tendency to be resisted. Years of treating the world itself as a sort of university had made me both covetous of what it had to offer as well as suspicious of its operation. Principally, I had my eye on the fault line that runs along all thought, evaluated and credited such that it may be influenced by outside interests. Of course, the university holds up an ideal of thought opposed to this and, like the average promise maker, holds good in the main. On the other hand, it is also very much like him when it comes to transgressions of the more minor sort. I couldn't be tolerant of the university's lapses as I could of the average promise makers, because, in the case of the former, a formal position was taken up with respect to truth-telling. The university was the institution that declared itself to be interested in virtually no other operation, or, if it did offer benefits and services of another sort, hailed these unquestionably valued attributes as being dependent on and subordinate to its one great operation. In a rough sort of way this was true, but, on account of this very roughness, I found it to be unsatisfactory. I sensed a danger in being so caught up in the university's ways and means, so caught up in its mentality, that its loose integrity, loose from where I was sitting, would have been correspondingly taken up. Such was the situation for me in the beginning, and such would it be for me for many years to come. So little of the social crusader was there in it, and yet so much of the spiritual, that I longed for nothing more than internal change and growth as befit understanding this situation. Putting myself in the belly of the whale, so to speak, was an experiment to see if it would regurgitate me, or if I would have to escape it like Odysseus from the cave of the Cyclops. Or, if on the contrary, I would be able to succeed with a certain amount of wheeliness in making some part of it my chosen domicile. Well, it was clear I was in no hurry, careful in my own way, and yet careless in the way of the world for not being more pressed and less fastidious. The importance that the average bourgeois attaches to keeping their house clean, or at least to that part most on display, was what I attached to my studies. Indeed, it unquestionably belonged to that part of my life where I was most hygienic and proper, most scrupulous not to let anything slip that I judged to be false or second-rate. Only on one occasion do I recall doing something a bit out of keeping with this, a bit contrary to what I had always attempted to do. It was an exercise in a course that I took directly after the one called 20th Century Poetry and Poetics. I ended up doing very well in it, but, with respect to the exercise in question, I wrote a short piece on a subject I didn't know very well and didn't feel very deeply. As a piece of creative writing, it failed, and the good professor let me know. But what am I to make of the fact that the only short story I ever wrote in my life came out of the same course, and that, furthermore, its nature, although not strictly autobiographical, was close to it? And that this same short story, although a very modest thing, was more successful than any play I wrote in the following years. Why did I spend 13 years writing plays that didn't succeed after writing a short story that did? Why did I write this story in the autobiographical mode and then not follow up with similar ones? Why continue to belabor these points if not to keep roughly to the task at hand, while giving me one more opportunity to posit a greater project stretching throughout my life and subterraneously at work? One of extended errancy, diversity, and self-examination that, by being able to be posited over and over again, allows me to think I wasn't a complete fool during those years. One thing is certain, that university studies attracted me and, like my European trip at its best, gave me no small satisfaction. I was lucky enough to find as well as judicious enough to set up conditions that were nearly perfect for me. Part-time studies, small classes, courses carefully chosen, as well as rejected, no sense of haste, these were some of the factors that made my first years at university so enjoyable. Never was I one who had to complain about being bored by a course or, with a few minor exceptions, some aspect of it. As much as I should give credit to the university for this, so I should give credit to the commitment I had made even before I entered it. In effect, I had vowed to myself that my studies there would proceed with pleasure and passion or not at all. Even to this day I find this zero tolerance for boredom in education striking. Apart from never having met anyone in university who held to it to the same degree I did, it sums up how much I strove to have the alignment of head and heart as perfect as possible. In truth, it was an ideal I kept on realizing in much the same way that a respectable, law-abiding citizen does his. That is, it was so infused with the image I had of myself that any abuse of it would have seemed an outrage that required immediate remedy or retaliation. Yet though I had some difficulties along this path, they never took a critical turn. At least this was the case all the long years I was a part-time student at the University of Winnipeg and then, for a couple of years later, a full-time one. This period of my life therefore invites, contrary to a later period, a story not of high drama but rather one of simply crossing swords from time to time with the powers that be. If I were to carry on from this point with a section that had the look of wanting to be entitled My Struggles, I would risk not only a presumption that goes without being punctured by criticism but also a simplification of matters that, so far as I can see, I have managed to avoid up to now. And yet however complicated things are, it can't be said that one shouldn't try to express them as simply as possible. This involves a constant negotiation that I never feel done with. In the case at hand, it is a matter of keeping in mind the close proximity between what one detests in scholarship and what one is indebted to. Between being repulsed, discomfort, and even unhinged at times and having the motivation, inclination, and handful of reasons to think long and hard about a subject. But detesting something is, on the one hand, a much more immediate state of affairs and feeling one's indebtedness, particularly towards the thing detested, is, on the other hand, a much more deferred and drawn-out one. Once bitter enemies often become old friends who look upon their former differences no longer as a warlike struggle but rather as one that, fought against some third party, was unfortunately marred and misunderstood by differing strategies. It takes time for such a situation to develop though. It takes time for various warlike attitudes and postures to break down because, once one takes up a position, it is very difficult to do other than defend it. To reinforce it over and over again and attack those who would dare to attack it. At least it is difficult if not impossible to make other moves than these at bottom for, as it must be admitted, there is a ceremony of innocence that goes along with them. A strong and no doubt necessary tendency on the part of thinkers to obscure or subordinate them by stressing a collective objective called truth. All of this I'm concerned to map out as best I can along with what runs cross-current to it, namely, the war of words that never ceases but only undergoes various permutations. Speaking close to home where I speak best, I should say that truth-telling could be viewed as an act of war despite all the talk about being indebted to the enemy and, as it might seem, wanting to be reconciled with him. For the enemy, more often than not, sees the olive branch being held out to him as a gesture merely disguising another one of less amiable and altruistic bent. True enough, there is seldom an open avowal of this since a large number of truth-tellers pay homage to an etiquette barring a process d'intention. A whole area of truth-telling, understood of course in the expanded sense, is thereby blocked off and, along with it, whatever inclination there may be to declare that the above-mentioned olive branch is in effect a laurel wreath with which one or another opponent of good will wishes to crown himself. All right, let it be admitted that there is this resistance of sorts that has followed a long and winding path and finally culminated in this long and winding, not to mention windy, report on it. Virtually everything that pertains to this largely defensive strategy points to preserving an integrity of sorts that is assailed on all sides and neither wholly right nor wholly wrong in itself. All that is wholly right is that things of this nature should have their exceptional moment, should have what keeps their value high and even what allows them to keep any value at all. If I had never believed myself to be one of these moments, it is not likely I could have propelled myself this far. How I have managed to do so has of course already been a good part of my task and, if I don't miss my guess, I will have to continue to bear down on this task even more than previously. One thing is certain, it is as heterogeneous as can be and only homogeneous to the extent that it focuses on a major preoccupation. My youthful social conformity and its tragic consequences. When I was very young and very innocent, ignorant of myself and the world, vulnerable to unruly circumstance, and desperately in need of stability and certainty in life, older and wiser minds set down the rules and guidelines which I, for the most part, adhered to, if not entirely without resistance, then without questioning their validity. From the earliest age my parents instructed me, often with praise or admonishment, to be honest with everybody, including myself, to be respectful of other people, and not to trespass on the rights of others. From my teachers I learned to recognize and obey those in authority, to assume good behavior, and to value hard work. All of this was meant to lay the groundwork for my development as a person and to help me find my rightful place in society. When I was somewhat older, less of an innocent, and more cognizant of myself and my surroundings, the pressure to conform took a radically different turn. My parents and teachers no longer held complete sway over me. They still had their influence, but now there came to the fore an outside will which wielded no visible authority yet was stronger than they were. It did not have to shout or scold me into submission but commanded without articulation and came from no one direct source. Its voice was the lure of social acceptance, and its command was to alter oneself, if necessary, to achieve it. In my early adolescent years I had a problem of not being able to win acceptance from my classmates because of an inherently shy and introverted nature. I used to spend most of my time reading and doing homework. Rarely was I a part of a crowd of laughing, jostling girls and boys. How I longed for the shared intimacy I saw among them. How I anguished over the shortcomings I saw in myself which impeded me from becoming as they were. Gradually I devoted less time to studies, books, and personal daydreams, and became a hanger-on with one group of classmates. I learned to talk as they talked and act as they acted. As they scorned books and studies, so did I. As they saw amusement in everything, so did I. Their ideas became my ideas, and their values became my values. The teacher was an enemy, the school was a prison. Parents were a nuisance, worse, a confounded annoyance intruding upon your privacy and interfering with your fun and freedom. Having friends over to your house and playing records was really the thing to do, and everything else mattered about as much as an obscure date in a history text. When my interest turned sharply towards the opposite sex, it was even more important that I be in. Two from my group of male friends began carrying on coy conversations with a couple of the prettiest girls in class. This soon progressed to open flirtation, and before long the four of them were announcing that they were going steady. The rest of us in the group, not having girlfriends, enviously regarded our former peers who were now a peg above us, and we sought to emulate them. We hung around our successful friends as much as we could, badgering them with anxious questions about sex and romance, identifying our needs with their needs, our desires with their desires, ourselves with their selves. Their girlfriends were quickly incorporated into our group, and as was natural, they brought a few of their female friends along with them. Even so, 1.5 years of heartache and feeling dreadfully abnormal went by before I had the desired feature of a girl walking by my side in the school hallway. My male friends now talked in a certain way about girls which I felt compelled to imitate. Its vocabulary included such terms and expressions as scoring, easy lay, how many times, and was she good? Never having done more than neck with my girl didn't prevent me from, as can be imagined, holding my own end up in these conversations. When I left junior high for high school, there occurred a big shakeup of friends and groups of friends. I retained no ties with anybody I had known in junior high. I belonged now to a group of sometime students who were basically a rude, coarse lot. Drinking beer, driving fast cars, fighting, going to weekend bashes, and making as many girls as possible were our main activities and what practically all our free time thought centered on. Although I did not fit in well with this group, I struggled to assume their attitudes of mind, habits of living, and priorities in life. I grew rough and surly with whoever was outside our group and whom I took a casual dislike to. I treated girls only as I thought they should be treated in order to win favors from them. I was forever skipping classes and, in those I did attend, I was inattentive and given to being smart with the teachers. Thus it should have come as no surprise to me when I learned that I had failed my final year. Yet it did. The distressing thought of having to repeat a year served me well in one way. I began to rethink the course my life had taken, to weigh the consequences it was having for me, and to question the results I was looking for. Everything that I had been earliest taught was contradicted and undermined by my efforts to win social acceptance. These efforts had retarded my growth as a person and diminished my chances of being successful in later years. Instead of trying to develop myself as a unique and independent person, I had hastened to identify myself with those around me whom I thought better off than I. I had changed my true thoughts and feelings, interests, and values that they might conform to those of the group. I had suffered a loss in myself of myself that no circle of friends, no association with others, and no family member or loved one could ever restore to me.